There is a statistic called migrant workers, which refers to people with rural household registration who work in cities and towns. The income statistics are similar to informal employment, which is relatively extensive. There is a lot of overlap between migrant workers and rural employment. Sometimes they work in the countryside, and sometimes they go out to work. In 2022, there will be 295.62 million migrant workers, an increase of 3.11 million. From 2019 to 2022, the average monthly income of migrant workers is 3,962 yuan, 4,072 yuan, 4,432 yuan, and 4,615 yuan respectively, which is close to the income of urban informal employment and significantly lower than that of formal employment. Many private companies don't care whether they recruit people from rural areas or urban areas. The education requirements are low, and the recruitment contract is simple. Just come and work. Many private business owners also do a lot of work themselves. They do not collect money through official bank accounts and pay wages more casually. But judging from the number of employees, these private enterprises are the main body of social employment, with nearly 600 million people. There are about 300 million migrant workers with rural hukou, exceeding the 279 million employed in rural areas. It is a common phenomenon for rural labor force to go to cities to work, live and even buy a house. There is not much surplus labor in rural areas. Although the urban population according to the 7th census in 2021 is about 900 million, accounting for about 64%, and the rural household registration population is still as many as 500 million. But the degree of urbanization of the rural population is not low, and many people only occasionally return to their hometowns to celebrate the new year and visit relatives' friends. Therefore, most of China's labor force already earns their main income in cities and towns. According to the above data, the labor force employed in cities can be roughly divided into 170 million formal workers whose middle-class families want more, and 600 million informal workers and migrant workers with lower incomes. Roughly judged, the former are the main members of urban middle-class families, and their lifestyles are at least partly in accordance with middle-class standards. The latter are the main members of the poor and ordinary families, and their incomes are lower. Except for a few people with higher incomes, there is still a big gap between them and the middle class. The past trend is that the income of both groups is growing at a high speed. The living indicators are improving, and they are moving towards the middle class. As long as the growth continues and the income doubles in another 10 years, the middle class can basically be fully realized. Informal employees and migrant workers can also earn tens of thousands of dollars a month, buy cars and houses, and live a lower standard middle-class life, and they are close to being developed. Before 2020, the income growth rate of ordinary workers will be relatively good, 2.5 to 3 times in 10 years. And the annual growth rate will be more than 10%. Indeed, in another 10 years, we will basically have the income of low-end developed countries, and our mentality is hopeful. There have been twists and turns in the trend in recent years, so anxiety has arisen in society. In the 3 years of the 2020 to 2022 epidemic, the income growth of formal employment is 7.6%, 9.7%, 6.7%, informal employment is 7.7%, 8.9%, 3.7%, and migrant workers are 2.8%, 8.8%, 4.1%. The number of channels has also decreased and expectations have deteriorated. And informal employment and migrant workers feel even worse. Another related statistic, per capita disposable income, is consistent with the trend of employment income growth over the years. From 2013 to 2019, the nominal growth rates of per capita disposable income are 10.9%, 10.1%, 8.9%, 8.4%, 9.0%, 8.7%, and 8.9%, and from 2020 to 2022 are 4.7%, 9.1%, and 5.0% respectively. In the first half of 2023, the per capita disposable income was 19,672 yuan, a year-on-year increase of 6.5%. From the perspective of historical trends, 8% minus 10% is a relatively normal and good growth rate, and 4% to 5% is low. The 6.5% in the first half of the year has recovered, but it should be higher. Income growth and consumption pulse cycle. The previous section introduced the basic situation of the income distribution of ordinary workers and the historical growth rate. If in the next few years, the income growth rate of several types of employed persons resumes 8% to 9%, or because the base is high, it drops slightly to 7% to 8%, it can be regarded as the rhythm of doubling in 10 years. Inside, major economic problems will be resolved, and a new 10-year growth period will bring China closer to the income and consumption levels of developed countries. Because it has not yet recovered and employment is still a little tense, it is normal for the society to have doubts, and there are more doubts from the outside world. College students feel bad about employment recently, because basically they still want to go to the formal employment of 170 million people. They feel that the income of informal employment and flexible employment of 600 million people is low and unstable. Many people will wait until they are 25 years old for the postgraduate entrance examination. Employment. The family also has the conditions to support Akira for several years. If the growth rate and absolute value of income increase, informal employment will also be attractive enough for college students. The author looks forward to and is very confident that the income of my country's main labor force will resume a relatively high growth rate. Some people suggested big moves such as paying money according to the person, and monetary expansion, which shows that China has a lot of policy reserves. Many countries have already done this. And inflation has become difficult to handle, and inflation in China is still very low. In my personal judgment, China's economic fundamentals are good and its productivity is strong. So it doesn't need a particularly big trick. As long as there is a basic line of expanding consumption and continuous promotion of consumption and income through various means, the growth momentum should be restored. In the early stage, China was pulling capital to drive economic growth, and the wages of the main labor groups were still at a relatively low stage, which could objectively reduce investment costs. The rapid growth of labor wages at a relatively low level is mainly due to the recruitment game. And it is impossible to recruit people without wage increases. Generally speaking, income growth is relatively easy. If investment is continuously increased and production is expanded, labor wages will naturally increase at a high speed. However, this income growth mechanism of can't recruit people without salary increase may fail at any time. If there is a sign of trouble, it will be easy for companies to recruit people, and there will be no incentive to increase wages. Many companies compete with each other and need to keep costs down in order to survive. And the growth rate of wages for employees has slowed down. Private enterprises are more sensitive, and wage growth has fallen more. In the stage of expanding consumption, the whole society needs a new economic awareness. The expansion of consumption needs to increase the income of laborers. Developed economies have a strong awareness of this and reject low wage. Low-price contracts because it will make workers' income insufficient and affect consumption, the most important economic foundation. In many cases, mainland Chinese companies that can provide low-cost projects, low-price services, and low-price goods are rejected because they will destroy the local labor income system. For example, Hong Kong companies do not allow mainland companies to accept project contracts at low prices and would rather engage in projects at sky-high prices. In China, when investment is prioritized and market economy efficiency is prioritized, there is a common phenomenon of winning bids at low prices and squeezing suppliers' profits. But at the stage when consumption is driving economic growth, the whole society needs to change its concept and stop rolling each other to death. It needs to be more humane. Treat business partners as a group of many workers and set aside profits so that the partners' employees can have decent income growth space. One phenomenon is that enterprises transfer production and R&D links from first-tier cities to second, third, and fourth-tier regions, effectively controlling costs and increasing the income of local employees. Much more is needed for such mechanisms. From the perspective of China's productivity advantage, foreign competitors are not terrible, and our price advantage is very large. The main reason is that the internal competition is too fierce, and sometimes it is even cheaper for outsiders. Because the scale of investment is too large, the growth rate has declined, and economic growth will inevitably switch to consumption-driven. This is a relatively easy task. Many countries can do it, and China has no problem. Through a series of active operations, or forced to do it, switching to consumption-driven is inevitable. The sign of consumption-driven switching is that the growth rate of consumption is significantly higher than the growth rate of investment. The final consumption rate of 55% in the previous chart will gradually rise to more than 65%. In fact, after 2010, the final consumption rate has risen from 48.9% to 55%. It would be nice to resume this upward trend. It should be pointed out that the ratio of China's fixed asset formation to GDP is as high as 45%, which is far ahead of other countries. This should not be regarded as a bad thing, because it is China's ability. It should not be thought that China will only rely on investment to drive economic growth. In the 1990s, China had a period of rapid wage growth, and many people's wages doubled rapidly. Now China's economic system is already very complicated, with a large scale in many industries. And it is unlikely to make major reforms like before. But there is no problem in principle, the direction is determined, the proportion of final consumption in GDP is increased. There is no problem with productivity, and various control methods can always be thought of. The recently issued measures on resuming and expanding consumption, and several measures on promoting the consumption of electronic products, are the correct models in my opinion. The direction is correct, the means are diverse, and multiple departments continue to make efforts in one direction slowly, and eventually they can always reverse the direction. It is a virtuous circle that workers' income increases, consumption increases, corporate revenue increases, and workers actively increase their income. A very favorable phenomenon is that, since wage costs only account for about 10% of the company's cost, as long as the company's products are allowed to increase some prices, the company has the ability to increase employees' income significantly.